All right, perfect. Looks like the recording has started. Hello, and thank you all for joining today's call, whether you're here live or watching the recording. Today, we are joined by Sid and a few other special guests who have some exciting updates for us about um, Azure Virtual WAN. Just a few things before we get started. Remember that this call is under NDA. While it is being recorded, please be careful on what you share outside of the things that Sid says is okay to share. Also, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or come off mute, and we'll make sure that Sid and team are able to address them. The recording will be shared out after the call to the announcement in which this webcast was advertised. So without further ado, Sid, I'll hand it over to you to get us started.
Well, thank you. All right, so just to get started, quick agenda. Today we'll be talking about the public preview of the Check Point Network Virtual Appliance integration with Azure Virtual WAN. We're going to talk about all of its firewall and security capabilities, and essentially give you an overview of Virtual WAN, its benefits, before I'll transition to Greg to talk about the technical use cases, how to actually deploy a checkpoint into Virtual WAN, and essentially show you how you can secure all your network traffic destined for Azure and your on-prem workloads without having to worry about high availability, provisioning, or hassle routing. And at the end, we'll show you how you can get started today with this integration. So first, we'll start with me. I'll give you guys an Virtual WAN overview for those of you that are unfamiliar. So Virtual WAN is a unified hub and spoke architecture that simplifies routing and security. So we are a managed wide area networking service that makes it easy for you to access resources across your cloud and on-premises environment. So what we have here is like your virtual WAN resource. And as you can see, there are a few virtual hubs in that virtual WAN resource. And what you can do is you can connect your remote users to your virtual WAN. You can connect your site-to-site VPN branches, your private connectivity express route data centers, your SD-WAN on-prem, and so forth. So a lot of pillars of virtual WAN. We're going to start with connectivity. And we'll start with branch VPN. So we offer branch VPN site-to-site connectivity, which essentially allows you to deploy an Azure VPN gateway in our Microsoft managed hub. And then this allows you to connect your on-premises branches to this gateway. We support up to 20 Gbps per gateway, and we have integrated with several SD-WAN partners to automate this process of configuring your on-premises VPN SD-WAN device with the right parameters to kind of automate this process of being able to connect to your VPN gateway. And then we also support network address translation in case you have overlapping address ranges for your on-premises VPN site. Next, we see here we have remote user VPN connectivity, which essentially allows you to connect your remote VPN users to your Azure resources, right? So you can deploy up to 200 scale units. This allows up to 100,000 connections and 100 GPS of aggregate throughput. There's also Global Traffic Manager in cases where you have multiple hubs with user VPN gateways and you want to make sure your users are directed to your hub's gateway that's geographically closest to them, just to reduce latency for your end. And then finally, as you can see here, we have support for the Windows client as well as the Azure, as well as the Mac OS client. Final pillar for your on-prem connectivity is ExpressRoute. So you can connect an ExpressRoute circuit into that virtual WAN hub, which allows up to 20 Gbps of aggregate throughput, similar to our branch VPN site-to-site connectivity. And then we also have this value add of having VPN overlay with an ExpressRoute underlay. So this is an IPsec tunnel with an ExpressRoute underlay for ExpressRoute encryption. And we call that VPN over ER. For security, we integrate with Azure Firewall, so you can deploy an Azure Firewall right into the hub and have these standard and premium capabilities. And then we also integrate with third parties like Zscaler and iBoss to allow you to secure your internet-bound traffic via your site-to-site VPN connections. And then I'm going to show the next aspect of virtual WAN, which are these virtual network connections. basically being able to connect your on-prem into your Azure resources. And all of this routing basically is handled by our virtual hub router, right? So we have this virtual hub router. It's sort of the brain of virtual WAN. It handles all the intelligent routing in our ecosystem and allows you to achieve spoke VNet to spoke VNet transit, automatic site-to-site VPN to express route transit, and site-to-site VPN to point-to-site transit as well. So basically, most of your advanced routing use cases will be accomplished in virtual WAN. You can have any-to-any transit connectivity with fully meshed hubs without having to manually configure your routing resources or your UDRs or your route tables. And we support routing intent as well. And this essentially allows you to secure your private and internet-bound traffic. And then finally, you can also configure a network virtual appliance in a spoke virtual network. And then you can have BGP peering, one of our latest features, to actually configure BGP peering between the spoke network virtual appliance and your hub router. But the final aspect here in routing, which is our integrated third-party network virtual appliances, will be the focus for this session today, because we're announcing the public preview of our integration with Check Point. And essentially how this integrated network virtual appliance program works is you can deploy an NVA directly into the hub, which automatically peers with their hub router to exchange routes. And so we as in Microsoft will handle high availability, provisioning, bootstrapping, upgrade lifecycle, a lot of things, health checks, load balancing, and we just try to make the NVA experience as seamless as possible for our customers. Today's focus will be our latest NVA integration with Check Point, a security network virtual appliance that offers advanced security and firewall capabilities. I'll hand it over to Greg Pepper from Check Point, who's going to talk more about the benefits and use cases of the integration between Microsoft and Check Point, and show how you can deploy a Check Point network virtual appliance directly into a vWAN hub today.
Awesome. Thank you, Sid, for the time, and thank you all for joining us here today. If you want to just take us into the next slide here, I appreciate it, Sid. When you think about how we implement and integrate, this really builds upon the last, honestly, 5-10 years that we've been integrating in the Microsoft Azure cloud, enhancing capabilities as the software-defined networking functions evolve, right? And it's not just that, it allows us to now integrate into that vWAN hub, right? Deploy those NVAs, but this is a new jointly managed or co-managed solution that's consumption-based on demand as a service, right? As opposed to you traditionally having to manage your own scale sets. And Sid talked about the complications of having to manage all of the layer 3 route tables, which at the end of the day is how we're really steering traffic in and out of NVA appliances, whether they're Check Point, Microsoft NVAs, other third-party solutions as well. So we'll take a quick look at how we ultimately deploy these workloads within the hub. We'll take a look at some of the different design options, considerations, and best practices. This will address both north-south traffic on the internet edge. This will address some of the east-to-west scenarios, whether it's inside of your cloud regions for VNet to VNet scenarios or microsegmentation, right? There's a whole bunch of use cases around client to cloud connectivity, and whether this is happening from the branch office or from remote access VPN, or maybe how do you help differentiate employees versus contractors, as an example. These are all different use cases, which depending upon your organization might require different levels of security swim lanes, right? It is at the end of the day up to you and your compliance and your governance teams to determine which security, which flows require advanced security, right? And how do we simplify and automate and orchestrate the deployment of those technologies? Because let's be honest, who wants to manage more infrastructure? Who wants more upgrades to do? Nobody, right? We understand that people want to have less management overhead, not more management overhead. So if you take us into that next slide here, please. I just wanted to take a brief minute to introduce myself, introduce Check Point for those who are not familiar. Right, we've been the firewall guys for the last 25, almost 30 years now. And though we're the creators of the modern firewall, our security technologies go well above and beyond just, being the default gateway of over 100,000 customers globally. Right, when you think about the software development engineers that exist both in our network security space, our endpoint, our mobility, We're going to zoom in and talk exclusively about our Azure VLAN integration. But when I think about the way our Harmony stuff works with Intune, when I think about other integrations of threat intelligence and cloud posture management, but when we think about Check Point as a whole, right, our solutions, our technologies, our quantum technology that's been in the hardware has lived in the Azure marketplace for many, many years now, almost a decade now, I want to say. Now, when we think about the evolution of this, right, we're now taking it and making it even easier and simpler to manage. Right. So if you look at the next slide, as I mentioned, I've been here quite a long time now. Not as long as we've been, in the industry right here, but as I like to joke, we've got up times longer than some of our competition has even been in business in doing this. And when we think about that core network security space, the beauty of being Check Point software technology is we lift and shift and bring all of that capability with us. And when you think about the threat intelligence information that we're consuming and sharing, right? We have millions of endpoints, that are running our anti-malware technologies, right? We have security technologies running on Android and iOS devices that similarly feed information up to our threat intelligence cloud that allows us to dynamically integrate with both our cloud technologies, which we'll focus on today, as well as cross-pollinate across all of these key technology pillars. Next slide, if you would, please. Now, I mentioned I've been here for quite a bit of time. I'm actually a two-timer here at Check Point with 6 years at Cisco between round 1 and round 2. And that picture on the lower right, that was me when I first joined the company here. And I say jokingly, I still have a smile on my face and I still have the hair on my head. And we've been a great place to be. And, our technology has been such instrumental in the implementation of so many enterprise security fabrics. And as companies are lifting and shifting and moving not just the data center, but maybe their wide area network, their database services, their collaboration tools, their emails, right? So much more of our security infrastructure now is living in these Microsoft regions, these Microsoft PaaS environments, the Microsoft IaaS environments. We're using some of their SaaS software as well. So if you take me to the next slide, please, Sid. I'm sorry, the one after this. When we start with the basics, as Sid mentioned, right, you're going to have a variety of different VNets that are connected into some type of hub region. Right, you may have branch offices. Now we'll talk about differences with VPN Connect versus those that are coming in across ExpressRoute. But logically, this is another key area of service insertion in terms of security. Now, I have 2 boxes being shown on the screen, and let me explain why I'm showing this, but calling this a single hub. The reason I'm referring to this as a single hub is that all of the east to west connectivity between the VNets, between the express routes, between my VPN gateways, they all come into one common hub of service insertion. Now, for some of our environments, they want a secondary hub. They want to separate third-party VPN connectivity from my private connectivity. Or maybe they want a routed connection across the express route between the data centers, but they want the remote branch offices to come in across the VPN. Where I'm moving with this is that, yes, it is possible to take the north-south hub, which is being shown in the leftmost box, and kind of bolt it on top of the east to west. And in a very small environment, that may work well. But for many of our customers, the ability to create separate swim lanes for north-south traffic from east-west is a recommended best practice both for policy, for performance. I mean, think about your express route where you may have that data center to data center connectivity, where you may have 10 to 20 gig worth of potential bandwidth and throughput. But maybe on the internet edge, maybe you're consuming significantly less than that, right? And that allows you, when we talk about the deployment of things like Azure VWAN hub integration here, the ability to selectively scale these units appropriately, right? Using the appropriate sized instances that allow the appropriate network traffic, right? And down the road with additional horizontal elasticity and auto scale functionality now, you'll have that ability on demand to just dial up the traffic inspection as needed without having to change the potential architectures. So even in our single hub design, it has still often been a best practice to use separate north-south swim lanes from east to west. Now, evolutions of things like gateway load balancer will change this down the road, right? It allows more ingress and egress routing intent. But when you think about that peering and the tunneling and the service insertion, this is the fundamental starting point. And again, the reason we do this is that anything that's either ingress from the internet coming into any of the VNets, www.mywebsite.com, www.stagingmywebsite.com, or even egress traffic, maybe VMs that are going outbound to get patches or talk to other cloud-based SaaS services, or even third-party peering as an example, right? We create one swim lane. Think about when we used to go into airports all the time. The ingress security controls in and out of the terminals are completely physically different than the egress security controls when you're leaving the terminals. Or like when you go to Costco to buy the toilet paper and the paper towels, right? You're walking in one set of doors where they're doing a set of inspections and validations of your card. And then when you're leaving the organization, when you're leaving with a bag full of groceries and stuff, we're leaving through a separate physical door with different egress security controls as an example. And by creating these independent swim lanes, it makes it more effective from troubleshooting, from policy, from performance. And even though we're doing the maintenance and operations on your behalf, it allows you to separate that east to west internal maintenance, potentially from that north to south front door. Next slide, if you would please, Sid. So I kind of tee this up a little bit in that for some of our customers, right, there is the desire to completely separate connections which maybe are directly connected or through my SD-WAN integration. I think back to one of those very large retail car places out there, that have thousands of locations and kiosks around the world. And they had a very large SD-WAN project bringing all of that into the front door of cloud, selectively sending corporate PCI and other traffic through security swim lanes. Right? These were completely different than extranet connections, third-party payment processing connections, corporate connections that are just monitoring IoT devices and other workloads and applications deployed at all of these various retail car locations. When you have these secondary hubs, it allows this individualized routing intent, right? And that's the way in which we work with the Microsoft Layer 3 integration to determine which traffic needs to be secured. Maybe you want to inject default, and that's everything outbound from the internet. Or maybe, again, we want to have certain public IPs that are ingressly mapped off of certain elastic load balancers. Right? When we think about the SD-WAN, the VPN gateway, the express route, each one of these represent an individualized layer 3 entity. That's fine. We can move on. Thank you. To the next one. In how we deploy these solutions. The nice thing is that we've made it significantly easier to both automate and orchestrate the deployment. And we now put this in an environment that's co-managed, so this VNet that has these NVAs, rather than it being in your own subscriptions, your own billing, it's coming as a service. Right now, there's a couple of different design options depending upon the use case. Right? Maybe you just want that single hub. And right, that's where everything has a singular routing focus. Some customers, depending upon the desire to separate different layer 3 connectivity, we might create multiple hubs. I'm thinking back to one of my large aerospace customers that's running, a few dozen scale sets today, right? They've got different corporate SD-WAN from third-party VPN connectivity, or even those who have remote access users coming in as an example. But the point is we choose the door number 1, door number 2, or door number 3, and these are the predefined templates, right? We have the ability now to automatically deploy this as part of an ARM template through the marketplace, just like you would find the traditional IaaS resources. Now, as part of this enablement and preparation, right, the various VNets that we want to provide east to west insertion or north south, right, we attach them in essence at the vWAN hub layer. And the beauty now, much like in the traditional UDR world, but it allows us to start to test the connectivity in a programmatic and systematic way. Right now, ultimately, the management station of Check Point's infrastructure is involved as part of this enablement. And part of the reason for that is that as the workflow exists, the NVAs, once they're deployed, they have to connect to the management server in order to connect whatever the security policies might be. So even if the rule set says any except, or if I have my full set of corporate rules and objects, now we'll see here in a minute, this can be traditionally on-premise. These can be running as a separate virtual machine within somebody's cloud Azure-based subscriptions. This could even be running as a service from Check Point's cloud, our Infinity Cloud. We offer management as a service. So for existing Check Point customers, we can capitalize and use everything you have today. For those who are maybe not and maybe don't want to go through the process of an on-premise or managing their own virtual machine, much like we're talking, the firewall can be managed as a service. The management as well can be managed as a service. So take me to the next slide, if you would please, Sid. All right, so I mentioned the marketplace is where you're going to find these templates, these images available. So if you search for Check Point, and that's 2 words, Check Point, or CloudGuard is 1 word, you'll see a bunch of different options out there, one of which being this managed vWAN security instance. And again, what this allows us to now do is deploy the managed, they co-managed and monitored jointly via Check Point and Microsoft. And then ultimately, this now, rather than charging you, BYOL or pay as you go based upon 2, 4, 8, 16 cores, that's the way the solutions are traditionally licensed. It's more of a bandwidth-based subscription, right? I'm going to have 200 meg or 500 meg or a gig or more worth of traffic, right? And this just comes off of your Microsoft Enterprise subscription, just like your compute database and other storage services are. Now, I will say, in the EA preview, we do have to whitelist and enable your subscriptions, both on the Microsoft side, on the Check Point side as well. And we'll provide some additional links later on where you can find access to that. But ultimately, once we have the NVAs deployed in this managed VNet, right, the management automation found and activated the policies, now it's really about that routing intent, right? Ingress, egress, and I'm going to use the north-south versus that east to west scenario, right? So you may not want to send all of your traffic to start with, or maybe depending upon your industry and the enclave, maybe one VNet needs microsegmentation, even host-to-host based capability, right? Azure has made it super easy for us to do that in the past. And with the automation now with Azure vWAN, it's even easier. Please, if you would, Sid, next slide, thank you. Lastly, and I mentioned the security and the policy, and this is where I think sometimes people, I don't want to say mess things up a little bit, but understand that, hey, the rule set which you had in your physical on-premise north-south firewall, though some of those rules may apply, not all of those rules are going to apply. The other thing that we want to think about is how do we make the policy as easy to use and manage as possible? And there's a whole slew of dynamic integration between the networked virtual appliances and the Azure-based subscriptions. So it's not just the routing intent that's automating and orchestrating forwarding traffic, but we can map policies to metadata attributes within the VNets, the load balancers, the subnets, the tags, the subscription information, maybe existing NSGs even, right? So we have the ability to create our policy that's highly dynamic. It's mapped to the Microsoft Azure subscriptions. And what's nice about this is this capability every 30 seconds learns about changes to the Azure subscriptions, and it allows us to update the rule bases in an automated fashion. Because let's be honest, who wants to have more firewall change management and policy rule pushes? Nobody. It's a trick question, right? We don't want to touch these things often. We want to have these be as automated and orchestrated as possible. So when we build these access rules, and that's the terminology we use, where we use objects, identity, and again, these could be Azure Active Directory users, these could be Azure subscription data center objects, these could be things coming from NAC solutions on premise. The key is that in the access control world, every one of you are going to be different, right? You've got different subnets and apps and users, and we're going to highly customize those policies. Now, on the flip side, we also integrate advanced threat prevention, things like IDS and IPS, things like anti-malware, anti-bot. You may be activating advanced sandblast capabilities for emulation and detonation and content deconstruction and reconstruction. And the reason I bring these up is regardless of the industries and customers that we talk to, we're all exactly the same, right? Keep the bad stuff off the network so that people can do their job and the good traffic can get through that's whitelisted in our access policies and allow me to both intelligently enforce dynamic threat prevention, but also then potentially perform those dynamic updates all the time, both if they're threat cloud updates about new CNC or malware or other things that we want to be blocking, or again, the dynamic integration with your Microsoft subscriptions and identity providers as an example, that allows all of these types of scenarios in order to happen as easy as possible. So we've now got these things deployed. We have the right rule sets on the devices. So now when the routing intent is modified and packets get to the NVAs, we're going to provide the appropriate forwarding. The nice thing is that the packets come in and out of Microsoft to Check Point. We send the packets directly back to Microsoft, and then they handle that layer 3 forwarding end to end. Now, for many of our clients, as an example, we're going to do this in a walk, jog, run mentality. Right? Even when we have the vWAN hub deployed, we're not going to set the routing intent on everything to start. Right? We're going to pick a few test subnets, and these could be on-premise. These could be from VNet to VNet as an example. It's super easy, and especially in the cloud, to spin up a small test VNet and validate and verify this integration prior to determining, hey, let's swing over these VNets, these subnets, these site-to-site VPNs when we have the appropriate level of change management. Now, the last thing I want to mention about the solution, and I did talk about it being a jointly co-managed offering, is the fact that the maintenance in and around these NVAs is now being handled by us, right? So when you think about whether it's minor jumbo hot fixes, whether they're major iterative versions, the onus and the operations of this is not necessarily put upon you. Now, the nice thing is we're not just going to randomly upgrade your firewalls in the middle of the night, right? You're going to understand from a workflow when you go from version X into version Y, but whether it's things that we're doing minor operations on and or major upgrades, we're going to have similar flexibility. You just don't have to spend your Saturday night doing it. Sid, myself, well, our teams, not necessarily Sid and myself, but we'll be the ones behind the scenes helping to make sure it happens. So with that, next slide, if you would. I mentioned this is available for early availability. Enrollment from a Check Point side, you'll notice the pages.checkpoint.com/CGNS -VLAN -hub-EA.html. There was a QR code, maybe, there we go. So if you're the camera type, that should take you to the landing page right there. But with that, I'm going to pause. I'm going to take a sip of my coffee here because that was a lot of information at once. If there are any questions that you have, feel free to drop them in the chat session, come off the mic, or even things that we haven't talked about today that maybe you'd like to learn more about while you have us all on the phone here.